But on the 2nd of January, all was about to change. 2 police officers from Sheffield approached a man in a parked car. Sat beside him was a local prostitute. When his story didn't add up, they began a search and found a hammer and a knife, both weapons used in the Ripper murders. The man they arrested that night was Peter Sutcliffe. After hours of questioning, Sutcliffe confessed. He was the Yorkshire Ripper. Detectives had got incredibly close to catching Sutcliffe over the years. They'd interviewed him 9 times. But the hoaxer had such an effect on the course of the investigation, the real Ripper managed to slip through the net. Sutcliffe was found guilty of 13 murders and 7 attempted murders. He was sentenced to life. At his trial, the judge said, the scent was falsified by a cynical, almost inhumane hoaxer. I express the hope that one day he may be exposed. It would be 25 years before that opportunity finally arose. 4 years ago, West Yorkshire Police's Homicide and Major Inquiry team started reviewing cold cases as far back as 1974. The Yorkshire Ripper hoaxer was one of them.
The most interesting part of the case was that we were able to discover these remnants, these little leftover bits of the envelopes still within the material we'd been stored.
Incredibly, scientists managed to harvest tiny fragments of saliva from the gum seal on the envelope of the 3rd letter.
The thought was going off in your head that, well, if they could get a blood group back in the 70s, then there's a reasonable chance of getting a DNA profile out of these now, even though it's so long afterwards. Once we'd obtained this profile, put it into the database, and then to our astonishment, there was just one hit from a person who'd been sampled in the Northumbria region. The chances of someone else licking that envelope compared to him was 1 in a billion.
I was told to go over immediately to the incident room. A team of detectives would be travelling up to Sunderland and I would be making an arrest later that day.
The name that popped up was John Humble. Back in 2001, when arrested for a minor offence, police took a swab and put Humble's DNA onto the national database. Years later, that would seal his fate.
We went directly to his house. I found him in his living room. He was surrounded by beer cans and bottles of strong cider littered on the living room floor. I told him he was under arrest for perverting the course of justice between 1978 and 1979. He was drunk and didn't respond.
Humble was 22 when he started writing the letters. Now, 49, and still in the northeast, he'd let his life go to ruin. But would he confess?
I did send it.
Just repeat that for me. What did you say?
I did send the letter.
I asked Humble to read a transcript of the Ripper tape, and we played the Ripper tape back to him. It was amazing. His voice hadn't changed.
I have the greatest respect for you, George, but Lord, you are no nearer catching me now than 4 years ago when I started.
Unfortunately, it had been a set of cruel coincidences and predictions, to some extent supported by forensic evidence, which had led the original investigation team away from Peter Sutcliffe and towards John Humble.
Finally, in March 2006, 28 years after he first penned a letter to police, the book was closed on one of the greatest mysteries in British criminal history. John Humble was convicted of intending to pervert the course of public justice. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison, a reflection, the judge said, of the impact his actions had on the course of the Yorkshire Ripper investigation. Having taken care to protect his letters from fingerprints, he couldn't possibly have known that 25 years later he'd be caught from licking the envelopes.
You know, I remember that tape. I remember hearing it on the news at the time. It was so distinctive. It had a huge impact on the investigation.
It did. It was a total disaster, a blind alley that cost £6 million and wasted so much police time. I mean, they interviewed thousands of people. They physically, manually checked 15 million letters from the Sunderland area to try to trace the handwriting. And all of that was for nothing. And all the time, worse still, Peter Sutcliffe continued his killings. He killed 3 more times after the letters and the tapes became public.
And why was Oldfield and his team so convinced that it was authentic and it was the right way to go?
It was a mixture of things. I mean, firstly, the style of the letters. Humble had actually used some of the exact phrases Jack the Ripper had used in the original letters in the 1880s. He just got those actually from a book. But for the police, it did seem to fit. Then, of course, there was all the detail, the predictions, the forensic links. All of that, again, seemed to convince the detectives. Again, all Humble was doing was looking at all of the newspaper articles at the time and picking out tiny fragments of information. And Peter Sutcliffe, he, of course, was watching all of this. And actually, when they caught him, they said to him, "Is that your voice on the tape?" He said, "No, but all the while this was going on, I felt safe."
It's a toxic mix. This tiny bit of saliva, all these advances in DNA profiling meant that that was all they needed, just this sliver.
I know, it's staggering, isn't it? I mean, you only need a fleck of dandruff. I mean, contrast that to the 70s when they were using this blood grouping evidence. That narrowed things down to 6% of the entire population, still a massive number. And yet the DNA that nailed Humble, that was in a 1 in a billion match. And you cannot escape that.
Always fascinating. Thank you, Matthew. Now, Rav, what's